hello and welcome everybody to episode 7 of the Void Wave podcast. And today we are going to discuss a little article that came out last year on Psychology Today, which is like an online psychology journal or tabloid, I guess you can call it. And they have a little column or blog which is called Hive Mind, and is run by a guy named Robert J. King. And he wrote an article that is called Good to Be Alive, Is Antinatalism to Be Taken Seriously? And
so obviously Psychology Today is a kind of very old magazine. It's been publication for at least 50 years. I don't know what's the relation between the online website and the actual kind of paper publication, but at least in this article I spotted at least kind of 4 spelling and grammar errors. So I'm not sure how much kind of proofreading they do for the online articles, or if it's more like its own operation, kind of separate from the paper. Because the paper version has quite good reputation in terms of kind of bringing psychology, the latest research in psychology to the masses. But this article did not give me a good impression of the online version of the magazine at all.
Yeah, I agree. And the way I understand it, like, it's basically like a monthly column or blog that this guy is putting out via Psychology Today, but it's not necessarily part of Psychology Today directly.
Yeah.
Like, it's a semi-independent thing that's just hosted by their website.
Yeah, so Dr. King is PhD, is a researcher in the School of Applied Psychology in University College Cork in Ireland. So he's published in the field of human sexual behavior and other topics, and he's published a lot in evolutionary psychology, which is a scientific field which is a bit controversial, to say the least. And here he's tackling antinatalism, because he heard David Benatar speaking on the Sam Harris podcast, and he found it outrageous, the thing Benatar was saying. So he decided to kind of write this shortish article on all the things that were wrong with antinatalism. And it doesn't get off to a good start, and then it just gets worse and worse the further it goes.
Yeah, I mean, King, he exclusively focuses on, the pleasure-suffering imbalance kind of argument in favor of antinatalism, and I don't think he really has a good grasp on it personally, because, well, for one, he doesn't actually elaborate either of Benatar's arguments, well, neither the axiological argument he makes, which is about value asymmetry, nor the empirical argument he makes in his book. So there's that. And the author then subsequently reduces like the whole of antinatalism to basically just that one position, the pleasure suffering calculus thingy.
Yeah. In fact, I've been studying logic for the past few months, and I was kind of going through the article and trying to kind of go, oh, this is that fallacy, this is that other fallacy. And, that, in that way, it was a bit of fun, because it was like, there was full of straw men where he kind of, he misheard Benatar, I guess, or misinterpreted what Benatar was saying. And then he created the straw man, and then he attacks the straw man, and he obviously wins, because what he's attacking is not even real. It's just something he created that he could beat. And then there's the fallacy of composition, where you kind of take a small part to be the whole, right? So antinatalism is just this one thing he heard about from Benatar. He does have like a reference in the end where he mentions Benatar's books, but then it's clear he hasn't read them to be saying the things he is. So the article is just a big mess. And I'm going to quote from the article now. His argument, if such it can be called, is that human life always contains more suffering than pleasure, and so on balance, it would be better if we were all dead. So this is just wrong to start with, right at the beginning. Not because the strongest part of Benatar's argumentation for antinatalism is not the pleasure-suffering balance. There's the asymmetry, the axiological argument, and others. But to say that it would be better if we were all dead is wrong, right? Because Benatar's argument is it would be better if we were never born. I mean, it's in the bloody title of the book, right? Right? Better never to have been. It's not better if we were all dead. And there's a big difference between something that is born, lives and then dies, and something that is never born, because someone who was never born cannot die. Sorry if this sounds very silly and childish, like I'm trying to explain the English language to somebody, but this is a serious article, and it starts like this, which is clearly didn't hear what Benatar was saying.
Yeah, I mean, this is a point that Benatar, on just about every podcast or interview he's on or interview he does, he has to elaborate this point specifically, right? That there's a difference in asking the question of whether or not procreation, that is, to bring a new human being or a new being in general into existence, that is not the same thing as the question of whether or not it's okay or it's good to continue on with an already existing life, right? Like those two are fundamentally different questions to ask because they're ontologically different situations, right? Like in the scenario of procreation, you start out at non-existence and then there is existence, right? That is what birth means. And death is kind of the ontological reversal of that, where you have somebody who's already existing and then they are exiting existence into non-existence.
Yeah, it's two completely
not
different states,
thing,
right? So in many ways, it's like saying, for example, that the moon is a place of death just because it has no life. No, the moon is a place of neither death nor life. It's just nothing, right?
Right, because as far as we know, there never was life on the moon. Therefore, it would be wrong to speak of it as a place of death, right? It's not a giant graveyard. If there never was any life, then there also wasn't any death there, right?
Then the article continues, and he has this, and I'm only mentioning this because we covered this in a podcast. It's as if the Children of Men was a manifesto rather than a dystopian nightmare, highlighting what would happen if human life became meaningless and welcoming it. So, if anything, the people in Children of Men are very regretful and sad that there are no births. There's literally like nobody in Children of Men kind of celebrating the fact that the birth rate is 0, right? So, if anything, Children of Men is the opposite of a manifesto for antinatalism.
We covered this pretty extensively in our episode on Children of Men. So if you haven't listened to that, check it out, please. It's our episode 2. And it's just, I don't know, the whole, it is as if Children of Men was a manifesto. That's just a very, very bad misrepresentation of what antinatalism means. Because obviously in Children of Men, the infertility crisis that is like the main plot point of the movie is not voluntary. Like it's not like people globally have decided, okay, we are not going to have any kids anymore. Like it's a catastrophe that was forced onto these people, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even necessarily something that antinatalists would want, right?
Yeah. And then he makes this claim. He says, highlighting what would happen if human life became meaningless and welcoming it. But then, I mean, somebody like me would say that human life is meaningless, and lots of other people would say, and major schools of philosophy would say that life is meaningless. This doesn't mean that you cannot create your own meaning, or that you cannot, accept this and try to form some reason for your existence or not. But he says, what will happen if human life became meaningless and welcoming it? But if all those people who say life is meaningless, then the author of the article doesn't then kind of offer any counterclaims. He doesn't propose anything to say, well, it's meaningful because of this or because of that. There's a bit at the end of the article where he says, he's talking about a Sophocles play for some reason, and he says, the ancient Greeks had this to say, one word frees us of all the weight and pain of life. That word is love. And I think, saying that the meaning of life is love seems to be a bit of a weak argument. And, well, not really an argument, it's just a word.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, he just throws these things out there, but they are kind of disconnected from his criticism, I think, because like in no way, shape or form does antinatalism mean that you cannot love somebody or something, right?
Yeah, but love is for the living, right?
Of course, love is for the living, but antinatalism is for the living too, right?
Yeah.
you have to be alive to make the decision, the conscious decision not to create any more life. And even if you assume that life, or have the belief that life is ultimately meaningless, which is also something that I share, like I guess you can call it like a cosmic nihilism. I don't think there's any great overarching purpose to life, but that doesn't mean that there can't be any meaning in my life specifically, like a terrestrial meaning, something that I create for myself in order to make this existence, bearable. And he seems to like totally disregard this. And he later on in the article goes on to talk a little bit about depression and meaninglessness, which I found very strange the way he handles it and took massive issue with it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read out the quote in full. Quote begins, "Let me just say right off the bat that I think some of the people identifying as antinatalists are suffering from depression. And I wonder that it's entirely responsible of other people who I strongly suspect are just playing at taking life to be meaningless to give depressed people even less of a reason to seek the help they might need." End quote. So yeah, I don't know. Like something like this coming from a psychologist is really eyebrow raising, I think. And yes, of course, there are antinatalists who suffer from depression, myself included, but having depression by itself doesn't invalidate your reasoning or the opinions or the beliefs you hold, right?
Yeah, that's
just bullshit.
This is a traditional ad hominem attack, right? Where you try
it's a character attack.
Yeah, it's a character attack. I mean, you could have the worst person in the world make a good argument, and that's a good argument. It doesn't matter who's it coming from. You might, of course, suspect their motivations for making their argument or what they ultimately want to achieve, but the argument might be correct, right? It's not related to the the arguments are not related to the person making those arguments, right? So if a depressed person, if Schopenhauer was depressed, if Benatar was depressed, if Cabrera was depressed, if all those guys and women throughout history who made this argument, if Buddha was depressed, it doesn't matter if the argument is good. Who cares, right?
Yeah, it's just besides the point, right?
Yeah,
if the argument is good, it's good, and then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Who the person is who made the argument.
Yeah,
right?
and I don't think that, for example, antinatalism makes people depressed or people who are depressed even more depressed. I see plenty of people who are just arriving at antinatalism in the Facebook groups and on Reddit, and some of them feel great joy about finding antinatalism because all of a sudden this thing which they felt was correct, all of a sudden they find other people who feel the same. So they feel kind of accepted and don't feel like part of this weird fringe of society that thinks procreation is unethical, and it becomes like a good part of their lives because they feel like this gut feeling they have is justified and is shared by other people. So I don't think antinatalists are going around depressing people on purpose. That just seems like a baseless accusation.
Yeah, he makes it almost sound like it's malicious with malicious intent, almost. I don't know. Maybe it's me reading too much into it, but the way it's written, especially the second part about giving people even less of a reason to seek help, right? That's just not what antinatalists do. Like, we do not discourage people suffering from depression or other mental illnesses from seeking help or otherwise improving their situation.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from.
It's just a non sequitur.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from. I mean, it's not from the Benatar interview with Sam Harris that's coming from, right? I think you can read Benatar's work, and I think the only part where he talks about depression is about the risk of somebody creating a child who then becomes a depressed child and adult, etc. But that's about it, really. Antinatalism doesn't follow from depression. Some people might go through a depressive episode and begin to question kind of the good parts of life and a sort of a balance of life, etc. But one thing doesn't necessarily follow from the other, right? There's plenty of people who are depressed making babies left, right, and center. It doesn't seem to stop them. So I'm not sure. Anyway, then he goes, to quote again, "But let's take the antinatalists at their words. Daft, though I think that word might be, this is not the language you'd expect from a PhD researcher, by the way. calling somebody just daft. Oh, that's just daft. And then
that might be a specifically Irish thing. I don't know.
Yeah, continuing the quote.
Calling people daft.
Yeah, that the whole of life's meaning can be reduced to pain and pleasure, right? So that's what he thinks antinatalism is, and I think we've talked about at length why antinatalism is not just about pain and pleasure, right? Because, for example, say the guarantee of death is irrelevant to somebody's pain-pleasure balance, right? And in fact, for people who have a really good life, the prospect of inevitable death might make the death even more of a threat and more anxiety causing than for somebody who's had a crap life. So I don't think this pain and pleasure thing is an essential element of antinatalism argumentation. In fact, there's a document that came out today. I saw it posted on Reddit, and somebody kind of collated all these arguments for antinatalism and common refutals, and I think they kind of synthesized all these arguments for antinatalism in a few bullet points, and there's about like 12 bullet points, and pain and pleasure is like one of 12 bullet points, and in my opinion, not even the strongest of them all.
Yeah, I mean, reducing the antinatalist position, or the antinatalist argument, that is, to just this pleasure-suffering calculus thingy, it's just, it's very narrow, and the way he presents it in the article as the whole of the antinatalist position is a little bit disingenuous, in my opinion, especially if you assume, he's telling the truth, that he's actually read Benatar, which is kind of doubtful, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, then he once he goes on to this pain and pleasure thing, he goes on to this huge rant about an experiment that was made where people kind of wired some kind of stimulus directly to the pleasure centers of the brain, and there was somebody pressing a button, and you could basically get people to do anything for people pressing that button, right? So because it kind of made them immediately experience bliss. So this was like a very unethical experiment back in the 50s. And then he uses this example of pain and pleasure to say, well, if you're an antinatalist, surely you would like to be rigged to this machine and then just have somebody kind of constantly stimulating your pleasure center. What can you say about this? He's made a mistake on the whole pain-pleasure thing, and now he's just kind of doubling down on this error. Yeah. To me, this is similar when people ask antinatalists, why don't they kill themselves, right? Which completely misses the point, because if you're asking antinatalists, they're alive, so they're not a non-existing being, which is the object of antinatalism. So I'm not again, sure where this is going.
Yeah, again, it's just not a relevant question, really, whether or not you could make existing people totally blissful or whatever, because the only conception of antinatalism in which this thought experiment makes sense or works as a rebuttal of antinatalism is if you have this very deeply consequentialist or strictly consequentialist or utilitarian conception of it, right? And Benatar, whom King is supposedly criticizing here, he doesn't think so. He doesn't see himself or his arguments to only be viable within a consequentialist metaethics framework. Like he writes in the book that he wanted his approach to be what does he use?
Metaethics, right?
Supposed to be metaethics. Yeah. But Benatar says that his arguments are supposed to be theory neutral, and what he means by that is that they should work in any kind of metaethical framework, or maybe not in any, but in multiple at least. So you don't need to be a consequentialist to hold or to use Benatar's arguments.
Yeah. Ultimately asking if this straw man of the pain-pleasure antinatalists who are constantly kind of balancing the two in their lives, and asking them if they would like to be rigged to a machine that constantly gives them pleasure and no pain, I guess. It's the same as asking if antinatalists would like to kill themselves, because one thing just kind of gives a lot of pleasure, no pain, and killing themselves kind of ends the suffering as well. But both of these things are not in the antinatalist sphere, right? In what antinatalists think about. So
yeah, because both deal with existing people, right?
Yeah.
That's the crucial thing. It's not about whether or not it's okay to bring someone new into existence. It's dealing with existing people.
Yeah.
So he's really missing the point when he makes this argument.
And then in the comments section of this article, actually there was an antinatalist who showed up to kind of maybe more than one, I think, to kind of fight with Robert King about this, and he and you know, and every time somebody was arguing against him about the article, he was saying, so would you push the button? Would you push the button? Would you be rigged to the machine for ultimate pleasure? And people are trying to explain antinatalism to him, and he just keeps asking the same question over and over again. And this is such a mistake, because even if you're an antinatalist, you might say, well, I'm an antinatalist, this is what I believe in. It might follow that you don't do anything about it. You might have an ethical position that you just decide not to pursue for whatever reason. And you don't need to kind of follow your ethical position to its ultimate consequences, which in this case is being rigged to machine and kind of pretty much kind of losing consciousness and any kind of agency in the world, to be an antinatalist or to be whatever, right? Or even to be a completely selfish utilitarian.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it's even questionable if hooking yourself up to this bliss machine is even part of the antinatalist position, right?
Yeah, it's not to start with, and then it follows that to hold an ethical position, it doesn't mean that you need to pursue it to its extremes in order for that position to be correct, right? It's asking a Christian, are you really a Catholic? Well, why don't you become a monk then? Because that's the shortest path to heaven. If you don't become a monk, you're not a real Christian. Come on.
It's an argument from hypocrisy, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Where you say, oh, this person has maybe 2 kids, and now they are saying they're antinatalists. What a hypocrite.
Yeah.
So therefore, the ethical position must be bullshit.
Yeah.
And that's just a faulty kind of reasoning, because you can be a hypocrite and still hold a position that is true, right?
Yeah. Oh, you're a communist and you have a mobile phone.
Oh yeah.
How
what
curious.
About Vuvuzela?
How curious.
Bottom text.
Yeah, bottom text, right? Oh, you're an antinatalist and you wouldn't be hooked to a machine that gives you constant pleasure while other people clean your poop and feed you through a tube. Because that's a totally normal thing to do, right? What a hypocrite.
It's kind of hilarious. Especially, I looked up like some of his articles, as you said earlier, on his academia.education page, and there he states that he actually has some training in analytic philosophy, which really surprised me, because if he really had any substantial training in analytic philosophy, he wouldn't. I think he shouldn't or wouldn't make these kind of low effort arguments.
Yeah.
If you can even call them that.
Yeah, you had a good word for this in our preamble, which was this article is more of a shit post.
Oh yeah, it's an elaborate shit post, right? There's one part in the article towards the end where he says, I'm quoting again, antinatalists shouldn't be wasting their time posting memes about how awful it is to have babies. They should be knocking on doors of the lab demanding neuroscientists get us all fitted with artificial brain stimulators. Which is, I don't know why he's complaining about memes while at the same time making basically a shit post, right? That's
yeah. So he says,
really hilarious to me.
Well, the technology is there, but I don't see enough of them jumping into this opportunity, right, to be rigged to a machine. So is it all just a pose? Is it all just a pose, Jonathan? What do you think?
Well, I think to be consistent with your antinatalist position, really the only thing that is required of you to do, what is obligational to you, if you call yourself an antinatalist, is not having kids. That is all, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know why he's talking about his stupid brain machine and posing or whatever, because as long as I'm not having kids and I'm calling myself an antinatalist, I'm, at least in my position, I'm free of his charge of hypocrisy, in my opinion. But as we discussed earlier, even if I'm a hypocrite and I had a kid maybe by accident or because I didn't know any better or whatever, that would still not invalidate the argument I'm making.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
I mean,
way to end your article.
You could have 12 kids and be a total hypocrite, and your argument could still be rock solid, right?
Yeah. Maybe it takes making this mistake 12 times before you realize it's a mistake, right?
Yeah.
So
or maybe you're not in a position where you cannot help yourself to make the mistake, like a lot of women around the world, right?
Maybe you're forced to have kids because of social pressure.
Yeah, and then it would be extremely silly to ask that person, well, if you're antinatalist and you're being forced to have children, why don't you kill yourself? I mean, these are, I don't think this kind of argumentation is part of a serious conversation, right? Hence why the shitpost comments. So coming to the end of the article, he talks about Sophocles, about a part in a Sophocles play where he seems to encourage antinatalism, but then he doesn't after all. And he says, one of the benefits of studying ancient philosophy is that it makes you a lot less impressed by whatever modern version of Daft thinking has caught everyone's attention. It's a typo in everyone's. Antinatalism isn't new, of course, he says. And he's, he says whatever modern version of Daft thinking, but, antinatalism started with Buddhism, Buddhism is replete with antinatalist references, same for Hinduism. And Buddha was born a full century before Sophocles, so, and most of the Greek philosophers. So, he could have done a bit more research, and this article is not a good impression on him.
I'm also failing to see what the point of this little addendum down there is. Like, what exactly is he trying to communicate there? Oh, it's not a new idea. Okay, so what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't understand why this is tagged on there, and the whole article it reads as like a polemic, a really bad polemic. Unfortunately, like I was kind of disappointed because of an article in Psychology Today. Maybe this is a good argument against it, because I would actually enjoy having a discussion about a good argument against antinatalism.
Yeah.
And, this article it doesn't deliver.
Yeah.
Right. Like in the beginning of the article, he's accusing the antinatalists of being shallow, and then he himself delivers an extremely shallow criticism in his blog post.
Yeah, and before this podcast, Jonathan and I, we were discussing kind of good arguments against antinatalism, and there are a few. I don't think they cancel out the arguments for antinatalism. There's so many things he could have picked up on, but he would have had to have done the research, and he didn't. And so here we are, dissing on Robert King, PhD, from University College of York.
Yeah, I mean, like as a closer, like he talks a lot about meaning and meaninglessness in his article, and just as a closer, I'd like to counter this kind of talk by him with a quote by the Norwegian antinatalist philosopher Peter Wessel-Zapfe. And this quote is taken from a 1990 documentary, which translates to be a human being. I don't think it's available online anymore, unfortunately. But if anybody listening to this has this documentary archived or knows how to find it online, please shoot us a message, because I watched it once and then it was removed a couple of years ago, and which is really sad because it's a good documentary, I feel like. And yeah, the quote goes like, each new generation asks, what is the meaning of life? A more fertile, pun intended, way of putting the question would be, why does man need a meaning to life? And maybe for a guy who likes evolutionary theory, that would have been a better starting point to discussing or criticizing antinatalism for King.
Okay.
I'm just going to leave it at that.
So that's all from us this week. We'll be back next week. Don't forget to kind of, I don't know, depending on the platform you are, maybe listening to this on YouTube, in which case subscribe. If you're listening this to some kind of podcast directory like iTunes or Spotify, click the follow button or whatever the equivalent of that is. As usual, send in your comments or things you want us to discuss to voidwavepodcast@gmail.com. And I hope, and thanks very much for listening, and goodbye.
Yeah, as always, thank you so much for listening. If you're listening to this on YouTube, I'll also put the link to the article in the description so you can have a look at it yourself. And take care, everybody, and talk to you next week.